My dear friends, good morning. You may have already played video games in which the Nazis won the Second World War, allowing you to beat them up without any remorse in our time. Or maybe you've read novels, comics, movies, in short, works that ask the question, what if? What if we hadn't invented the wheel? What if Henri IV had not been assassinated? What if Claude François hadn't wanted to change his light bulb that day? Well, today I'd like to talk to you about Uchrony and the great terrain it offers to have fun with history and to try to understand stuff. Let's go. History is a science. It has its own methods, its own codes, its own rigor in the use of sources. In short, ways of differentiating serious works from completely twisted discourses. But history is a human science, which means that it studies human realities and not physical or natural realities. History is therefore a very literary discipline, simply because it tells the story. It tells stories. This is precisely what is fascinating, and I am not going to say the contrary. However, the human sciences, such as sociology, anthropology, or history, have a difficulty that the natural sciences, which are sometimes called hard sciences, do not have. The historian, unlike the physicist, cannot carry out experiments. History is not and can never be an experimental science. It is condemned to shed as much light as possible on things that have already happened, to unravel causes and consequences that it does not control. On the contrary, a physicist can build a device to create particular conditions and repeat experiments. By changing a few details such as the pressure of a gas, the temperature of the room, etc., he will be able to vary the result, measured with precision. This lack of precision is often the reason for a certain contempt on the part of the hard sciences toward the supporters of the soft sciences, time travel being theoretically impossible, unless we isolate French people on the moon and give them a king to observe if they end up cutting off his head. We will unfortunately not be able to make historical experiments. At least not real experiments. But there are thought experiments. Physicists also use it. One of the first physicists, Galileo, developed the theory of falling bodies in this way. This theory, according to which bodies all fall at the same speed in an empty space, regardless of their weight, was described by Galileo even though he had no means of making a vacuum in a room in the early 17th century. However, his theory was quite true, as many experiments have since shown, such as that of astronaut David Scott on the moon in 1971, who dropped a hammer and a feather together. This example shows us that it is therefore possible, given the right data for the problem, to draw good conclusions, even without being able to verify it with certainty. The principle of the thought experiment can thus be of great help in history, to make hypotheses and extrapolate the available data, even without possible confirmation. And it turns out that the thought experiment has a name in history. It's called Uchrony. The term Uchrony was founded in the 19th century by the French philosopher Charles Renouvier. It was inspired by the term utopia, created by the Englishman Thomas More in the early 16th century. In these words, the prefix "u" denotes negation, associated with topos in utopia. It means the place that does not exist, which was the subject of the book Utopia, an ideal society, an imaginary place. The same prefix associated with the root chronos in Uchrony means the time that does not exist, or the alternative history. A story of Uchrony is therefore a story that develops a history that could have happened if something had happened differently. This something different. It is called the point of divergence. It is usually an emblematic event, a crisis or a battle that is resolved in another way, or an important character who dies, or on the contrary survives. The next step is to imagine what happens next, like for example a guy who kills Hitler as a baby. You know the trick. If Charles Renouvier invented the name of Uchrony, he is not the first to have written a Uchrony story. The Roman historian Titus Livius already imagined in his Roman history what might have happened if Alexander the Great had continued his conquests. But this is only a short passage in his work. The philosopher Pascal, in his Pensées, also imagines what could have become of the history of Europe if the English conqueror Cromwell had not died a few years earlier. But here again, it is only a short digression. The first to write an entire book of Uchrony is actually a man named Louis Geoffroy, son of an officer of the Napoleonic Army. He published in 1836, Napoleon or the Conquest of the World. He places the point of divergence in his story in 1812, during the Russian campaign. Instead of being a failure that ends with the catastrophic defeat of the Bérésina, Geoffroy imagines that it is a great success, The Tsar is taken prisoner and Napoleon returns triumphant with his grand army. Then he invades England and even launches an assault on Asia, then Oceania and Africa, before America, frightened by the incredible French power, capitulates without fighting. The author thus unfolds the dream of a universal royalty of the imposition of the French language on all continents and the infinite glory of his beloved emperor. Clearly, here we feel what animates the author. To write this Uchrony is to take refuge in a certain melancholy. It is a consolation in the face of the horror that the end of the emperor represents for him, even if it is totally unrealistic. Napoleon's grand army was certainly impressive. But from there to complete the conquest of the world in 15 years, one should not push. Afterwards, other authors try their hand at Uchrony, among them Renouvier, then who coined the word and imagined a Roman Empire that got rid of the Christians, did not disappear, and embarked directly on modern discoveries without passing through the Middle Ages. European writers developed national Uchronies in the 19th century, imagining their countries carving out a much better place in history. In the late 19th century, in Cuatro siglos de buen gobierno, and you'll forgive my accent, Nilo Maria Fabra imagines, for example, that Spain never lost its empire in America and that it has become a superpower that is preparing to colonize Mars. In the 20th century, Uchronies are multiplying. Tragic events being legion, it becomes quite tempting to imagine alternative versions. The period most chosen by the authors to situate their point of divergence remains to this day without question the Second World War. For example, we imagine a victory of Hitler as Philip K. Dick does in The Master of the High Castle, or Sarban in The Sound of the Horn. More recently, Uchronies are even spreading to other media, such as the cinema, or of course, the video game, which has popularized the genre with successful titles. I had already spoken about it besides in an episode of the Acht series that I realized in 2018. I'll put the link in the description. The Uchrony, it is above all a literary genre which pursues above all the objective to entertain. But beyond that, we can ask ourselves, can Uchrony be really useful to historians? It must be admitted that for many of them, it remains rather suspect, and they see it at best as a waste of time, not very serious for those who practice it, and at worst, a dangerous fraud. However, there are others who are convinced that Uchrony can also be a tool for making history. As has been said, history has the disadvantage of not being an experimental science, which can reproduce and compare results to derive general laws. The historian can therefore only use thought experiments to verify the soundness of his hypotheses. The process is even used by biologists who imagine what the Earth would have become if the dinosaurs had not disappeared. Wondering what might have been is not just a literary genre or a tool for historians. It is a universal mental process, essential to our learning. It is what makes it possible to foresee the consequences of our actions. Typically, you have used it by asking yourself, if I had taken this sauce instead of that one, would it have been better? Or if I had chosen this lottery ticket instead of the other one, would my life be different? Finally, many historians resort to Uchrony for a few pages to illustrate a possible point of divergence, to test a hypothesis before returning quickly to the real events. For the historian, Uchrony can also serve to break myths, to highlight the great structures of history. By removing a great man, one of those who are supposed to have made history practically on their own, one can realize that things do not necessarily change. Thus, to the question, what if Hitler had been admitted to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, one can answer that another might have taken his place as leader of the extreme right. The terrible economic crisis in Germany at the time would not have been eliminated, and another organization could have replaced the Nazi Party. When asked, what if Pontius Pilate had pardoned Jesus, one can imagine that another religion similar to Christianity might have emerged. In the context of the great political and religious upheavals in Palestine at that time, this is even quite likely. This type of approach, which removes from history the great characters and their influence, is in fact the exact opposite of that of the first Uchronian novels. It does not make Napoleon a Superman who changes the course of history, but removes him to nuance his role. It can show that in the end, even with a point of divergence, the course of history will have remained more or less the same, since men are only the product of their time, and their choices are determined by structures that go beyond them. But since it depends on the imagination of its author, the Uchrony story can also illustrate the opposite. Faced with a rather fatalistic vision of history, which wants individual choices to change very little, other Uchronies give pride of place to insignificant actions that have great consequences. This is called the famous butterfly effect. By introducing a tiny change, such as a character waking up earlier or turning left instead of right, and imagining what follows, it can break the illusion of fate that this was bound to happen. All the choices, even the most trivial ones, become divergences with potentially infinite consequences. If you're scratching your nose at this point in the video, just think about what would have happened if you hadn't done it. If you have an imagination, it can be quite dizzying. Anyway, I'll let you tell me about it in the comments because I'm quite interested. If we follow this pattern, uchrony becomes a means of opening up the field of possibilities and of combating a certain resignation to history. One affirms free will against destiny, which can give hope to those who wish a change by showing them that it is possible. For the historian, writing a uchrony forces him to put himself in the place of the historical characters, to imagine their doubts or the chances that modified their choices, and to understand the point of view of the people who made history. It is also better to learn from it. Uchrony, by exploring an alternative, makes us understand why a decision was visionary or disastrous. And in doing so, it reminds us that choices can have serious consequences and warns us of the dangers to come. This is what the American writer Philip Roth did in The Conspiracy Against America, published in 2004. In this novel, he imagines that Franklin Roosevelt loses the presidential election in the United States in 1940 and that Charles Lindbergh, elected in his place, allies himself with the Nazis. Wondering what would have happened in this case necessarily shows us that it was not desirable and that we must remain vigilant so that a similar situation does not occur in the future. Finally, uchrony can be used to teach history. By changing an event in the historical narrative, one can have students imagine what happens next, and this requires them to know the narrative from which they are supposed to deviate and to master the context, root causes, etc. It's actually a great exercise in practicing history the way one would apply mathematical formulas after learning them. And clearly, it can be a lot of fun. It's fun, creative, so it's enjoyable for the person doing it, which can help with the memorization of events. As we have seen, there are many positive points to uchrony. But creating a uchrony still presents several risks for the historian. Moving away from the sources can very quickly lead to nonsense, to neglecting the root causes in order to keep only the details blown out of proportion. Uchrony is an ultra-malleable tool that can therefore serve the best intentions as well as the worst, unfortunately. Nostalgia, propaganda, or even negationism. But by taking a few precautions, this approach can become a precious tool. We have seen it used on a precise point. It allows us to highlight secondary causes, hesitations, or coincidences, to nuance the overestimated role of a character. It can be used to contradict fatalities, to warn of future dangers, but also to give the taste of history by letting it be discovered under a rather original aspect. Today, uchrony is experiencing a revival of interest, as can be seen regularly in magazine issues or in more substantial publications. Maybe because today, precisely, we live in a time where the future is uncertain. In our 21st century, which has seen the great explanations of the world such as communism or capitalism run out of steam, which has given up hope for continued progress, which sees everywhere the awakening of conflicts or, much more recently, of a pandemic, uchrony has a new interest. Alternative scenarios can become breaths of fresh air that allow us to explore happier possibilities, to give free rein to our desires, or to reassure us that it could all be much worse. In short, uchrony allows us to give a little bit of sense to what we live today. And maybe, if you hadn't watched this video, well, you would never have thought about it. Thank you for watching this episode, prepared with Luca Pacotte. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and tell us what you thought about it. See you soon on Nota Bene. Bye.